So we have at least now like a working definition of permaculture. Ecosystem design. That's a good, that's kind of like short for it. It's ecosystem design, and the idea really is if we study and understand how healthy ecosystems work, we can then apply that same logic to designing just about anything, right? So now we're gonna, like I say, take this little detour and go into some material. This is really going off the permaculture kind of teaching guide, but it's more personal reflections of my own studies and things that I've become fascinated by over the years. So I'm gonna talk about this. A lot of this stuff I'm going to talk about over the next hour or so comes from Ken Wilber, who he came up with a system called integral theory, which I found absolutely fascinating when I was in my 20s. And I'm going to go through some of the basic things that he made, and I think he made some really brilliant points. Ken Wilber called himself like a map maker. So he said that he was particularly fascinated by like mapping out the human experience and sort of helping to put it into context for people, to give people a broader view with which to look at problems, right? So some of this really is, some of the guiding points behind this is like Einstein's thing, the quote that's attributed to Einstein of like, you can't solve problems from the level of awareness that created them. So a bit, like I say, if you're not really into philosophy and stuff and you're just like, I just want to learn how to fucking grow food, man, shut up. Just bear with me with a little bit of this stuff, because I think I've certainly found in my own life that this stuff really helps me to make better decisions and to see more of the picture of what it is I'm trying to look at. So, okay, so a couple of really brief terms that are good to describe. Ken Wilber came up with the term Holon. Everything is a Holon. A Holon means everything is a thing on its own. Kenzie talked about this morning. Everything is a thing on its own, and it's part of a bigger thing, right? So an atom is an atom on its own. You can study it as a single atom, or you can look at its behavior as a wider group of atoms of the same thing, or you can look at how it operates within a molecule, right? And so everything works like that. Molecules are molecules on their own. They're made up of a bunch of atoms, and frequently, especially on planet Earth, they gather together and they form parts of cells. And cells are cells on their own, and they group together and they make up bodies. And there's no top and there's no bottom in that description. Okay, so holons, it's a really good thing to understand. And we'll talk about it more. The next thing, the general trend of evolution in the universe is an interesting thing to have a basic understanding of. It seems that the universe goes in a direction of increasing complexity, right? As things get more complex, they get deeper and they span less of the universe. Right? And this is actually a mistake people make a lot. The universe is totally infinite, right? And it's made up of these tiny building blocks. Oh yeah, and so not only does it go in that direction, but there's another very clear trajectory where things go in the direction of energy. The universe is made up of energy. That's what the Big Bang is. It's all the energy in the universe contained in a tiny little thing, spreads out. Energy, which we'll talk about in another lecture, turns into matter, right? First it turns into subatomic particles, then atoms, then molecules, all the stuff we've talked about. And so where there's energy, first we get matter, and then eventually, after billions of years in the life of in the span of the universe, we get life. As far as we know it, we only get life on planet Earth, right? And that's very interesting. It's almost certain that there's life other places, because there seems to be a very definite trend. And in science, they study two different things. You have physicists who study things in the physiosphere, and you have biologists who study things in the biosphere. But the biosphere is to do with life. And the difference really between life and kind of inanimate objects is the level of depth. Well, there's two things. A, life multiplies and it makes more life, right? So that's really interesting things. And the way into the biosphere is between a male and a female. And that's true of plants and animals and humans and everything. And when we get into the biosphere, we get a new thing happening, which is you get an interior realm to things, right? So you can start, when you're looking at any holon, anything in its constituent form, its individual form, you can either study it, you can either look at the exterior of it and you can say, what can I what's going on the surface of this thing that I can see and measure, right? That's called the objective realm. What's true and measurable about this thing. And then it will also have an interior. What's going on in the inner world of this thing? Now, atoms probably have an inner world to some level, but it's very, very not worth mentioning. When we get into the biosphere, things start to get much more interesting, right? The interior of things becomes much more pronounced, right? And then we can also study things. We can also study any holon from the point of view of the individual, I, or the group, we. Right? And so this is what Ken Wilber called his quadrant system, right? That everything that exists, everything that's a holon, has a surface that you can measure and understand, and it then has an existence as in a group and individually. And then it also has an interior that has to be, the interior has to be interpreted. And that also can be looked at for the individual and for the group, right? And so you can do this with anything. So look, let's take something like a deer, right? And you say, well, what's, if you start down here in the group objective, it's like, well, what's the herd size, for example, would be a question, would be an objective measurable to do with the group. What's the herd size? Herd size and structure, right? By structure, I mean like all herbivores arrange themselves into like a hierarchical structure, right? With an alpha and it's not a totally linear structure because then you have family structures within that. You have mothers and they look after their offspring. And interestingly, the more evolved animals get, the more cooperation between females you get. That's a really interesting thing to look at in the animal kingdom, and that actually allows for the grouping together of larger and larger groups, right? So what's the herd size? What's the available food supply? Would be another, like how much pasture do they have to range on? Available pasture, available food supply, predators, threats, right? Those will all be things you would look at for the group deer on the surface, right? Then you would say, well, what, with an individual deer, you'd say, well, what breed is this deer? What's the individual genetics of this deer? Is it a male or a female? How much does it weigh? Right? And of course, all of those things, everything in this quadrant will be very related to what's going on here. Right? Like the weight of the animal will be very much related to how much food is available. Right? And then you get into the interior realm of the world. What's the emotional state of the deer, of the individual deer now that we're looking at? What's its emotional state? What are its relationships like? What's going on? And these things can be measured, right? Like I said, the interior has to be interpreted. So you can look at the female deer with her offspring and say, I think she's happy. She looks happy there with her kids playing around her. but it has to be believed. Now, a scientist could come along and he could measure that on the objective realm, and he could hook the deer's kind of brain up to a MRI thing, and he could say, oh yeah, look, there's this level of brain chemistry going on when the deer is with her offspring, and then when the lion comes along, that changes and the deer changes to being stressed. You know, does that make sense? And we know this to be true as well, because we know it in the animal kingdom for sure. We know that any dog can tell the difference between a human, right, and a human that the dog has an emotional connection with. It's one of the reasons we like dogs so much. And then you have the group subjective, which would be like, well, what's the sort of emotional situation between families, but within a family and between all the different families in the herd, and what are the, you know, what, this is really down here, this lower left, this group subjective is like, what's the cultural landscape for the deer like? So this is where culture comes in, right? And anthropologists are people who study culture, they tend to not spend very much time writing about the cultural significance or practices of herds of deer, because like we're going to talk about now, there's actually not that much, at least compared to human beings, going on, right? It's like a fairly finite world. But the thing I want to get across here is that for any holon, you can do this. So for anything, you can do this. And like I say, you could do this for an atom, and you could say, well, how does the individual atom behave? And what can we tell about the atom? How do the atoms behave as a group, right? But then when you go into trying to analyze the interior of an atom, you realize there's not much going on, right? And so it's not until we get into the biosphere, into the world of living things on planet Earth, that we start to see really important, significant things going on in the interior realm, right? So that's the first thing to mention. Okay, and then with specific regard to human beings, right? Let's keep this up here actually. Objective, subjective. Objective, subjective can also be kind of like interior, objective, exterior. Exterior means measurable. And so specifically with regard to human beings, we come along in the evolutionary chain somewhere around 150, 200,000 years ago. There's actually wildly varying numbers put out there depending on who you listen to, but it's something around that, and we're evolved from primates. The first thing that we start doing, really the first thing that we start doing is we start cooperating together, sharing food on a scale that's never seen before. Primates do share food, but not to the same extent. And interestingly, it seems being fathers, right? That's a new thing. Primates don't do that, right? So human beings start to have families, and start to have kinship, start to have tribes, families and tribes. Systems fit in here, right? So systems have to do with how do they get their food. Food production systems would be one of the main systems. So the first peoples that we know of are hunter-gatherers, right? Hunter-gatherers. And what else can we say about that on the sort of like, what else have we got? What else can we say about hunter-gatherers on the group objective sphere, right? Usually no writing, right? So they don't write stuff down. So they only have oral sort of stories and ways, so they communicate verbally. And for that reason, because there's nothing like written down, we don't know. We're limited in what we can actually find out. But there has been like there are like existing tribes today that have been studied and anthropologists have done. So, but we're working a little bit on scraps, and this is kind of like real prehistory stuff anyway. But we do know that these people are ancient ancestors. They have a neocortex, right? Now, the neocortex is directly related to the development of a neocortex is directly related, as far as we can tell, to two things. One, the discovery of fire, right? Cooking food means that energetically we get to spend way less time digesting our food. Previously, we're descended really from scavengers, right? So when you're scavenging food and eating meat raw, there's a huge energetic cost required to digest it, right? Whereas once we start cooking our food and fermenting our food, we kind of get to save an awful lot of energy in terms of digestion, and that energy really gets rerouted up to the brain, and we start to develop a neocortex. And also the role, I think, of the father in child rearing sort of prolongs childhood, yeah, and it allows anyone who's had a kid will know that, like, it's very slow very slow for them, because they come out half formed and they spend the first couple of years growing a brain, which you absolutely would not have time for in the sort of like normal animal kingdom. You just get eaten. But kind of because of these things, we're able to develop a neocortex, right? The body of hunter-gatherers is something the body of an individual hunter-gatherer is something that we know a lot about, actually, because of like archaeological evidence, and it seems like just fantastic specimens of human beings by all accounts, right? Like, so really like strong, agile. If you took one individual, there's a very good chance that they would be, by today's standards, extremely strong, extremely agile, right? And then if you look at the interior realm, go over here now, right? So there's a neocortex. So once there's a neocortex, love is possible. Like I say, there's now an ability to sort of live. There's abstraction. We see down here, there's paintings, right? So there's an appreciation of beauty and art. There's probably, based on, and we don't know, like with what was the interior landscape of a hunter-gatherer 200,000 years ago. We don't know, but we can guess that there's probably a high level of connection to the natural world and kind of to the present moment, in a sense, right? All the stuff that we struggle with today about like being present and being focused and being connected to nature would almost certainly not have been an issue, right? So there's probably a level of kind of connection. And probably like a naturally high level of attunement to the natural world, right? But that would be an interior thing, and again, you can only guess at it, really, right? And then group structure then culturally, then, so that's what an interior is like, or that's what an individual is like. But for the group of a whole, culturally, what do we know about hunter-gatherers? Well, this is very generalized, but oftentimes they were matrifocal. Meaning, and have a belief that God is kind of a woman, is what that means. So matrifocal, somewhat, and we're generalizing here, but somewhat would have had a kind of a like animistic kind of like would have pagan animistic cultures, so they would have somehow often tended to conceptualize God as being a woman, often kind of revered nature and the animals and the symbols of nature. Again, coming from this individual sense of connection that would have been necessary to gather food from a wild ecosystem, right? So hopefully now we're seeing how all of these things kind of interact with each other and how one causes another, right? So anyway, at some point in this story, at some point here, there's a shift, probably down here in one of the systems, which is the food production system. And we start to switch to agriculture, right? And agriculture really just means you go, hunter-gatherers for sure, there's an awful lot of evidence for this now to show that hunter-gatherers are not just wandering around finding food randomly. They're managing their ecosystem, especially in the Americas. There's all kinds of evidence of kind of like a horticultural approach, right, where there's some kind of crossover between gardening and ecosystem management and hunting. So there's a kind of a gray area here, but at some point people become agriculturalists. And it's an interesting switch because the technological thing that changes down here is, especially in Europe, is the discovery that you can till the land, that you can hook a plow up to an ox, plow the land and plant a grain. Now this has like profound changes on the direction that humanity goes in. In Europe, we used animals to plow the land, and in the Americas, they use fire. Right, so slash and burn agriculture becomes a big thing for the Mayans, for the Aztecs, for the Incas. So now this changes everything, right? Because once you can produce more food, much more food for people than the natural limits of the ecosystem, well, numbers start to go up, right? So populations start to rise. So that's again a thing that we see. That would be like, well, what was the population density? That would be a thing that goes in here. That's an objective lower right quadrant thing. But then that change in diet has profound implications as well, right? So the diet switches from being, you know, usually a protein in the form of fish or hunted animals with lots and lots of wild plants and mushrooms, right? So a very varied seasonal diet now starts to become less varied, right? So that has an effect on the bodies of the individuals within this system, right? There's kind of a general switch that happens between life expectancy goes up and health goes down slowly, right? In the sense that like your average hunter-gatherer would have been basically an Olympic athlete across about 20 different disciplines, but he or she probably would have only lived till about 28 or 29 and would have had a very high chance of dying a violent death, actually, right? Whereas once we switch to being agriculturalists, we become more sedentary. Not everyone is involved in food production, right? So that allows people to sit around. And the capacity for abstraction increases in the individual. Capacity for abstraction increases, right? So you can sit around more, you can think more, philosophers start to emerge. Writing becomes a thing for agriculturalists, right? Writing and legal systems, they become a thing. First, actually, writing, it seems like, comes along because you get more of a stratification of society. You switch from kinships and tribes to kingdoms, right? So the organizational structure for agriculturalists goes from being tribes to kingdoms. Right? And you get now for the first time like legal systems and taxation systems, right? Everyone has to pay tax to the crown. You need to write for that to happen. But there's an unexpected side effect of that, because now the individuals who have a bit more free time can start to write down and they can start to philosophize. And when we start doing agriculture, the amount of time dedicated to art and philosophy and just musings in general seems to really, really increase, right? And culturally, agriculturalists are patriarchal. God's a man. They're patriarchal, and they have a mythological base, right? Mythology becomes really important. Hunter-gatherers have a magical or animistic orientation, right? So, and magical, that's also that's a developmental level, right? There's more of a, things just happen. The sun comes up, the sun goes down. Isn't it amazing? And when you switch to a mythological base, it's like the sun comes up because God tells it to go up, and it goes down because God tells it to go down. And if we're nice to God, He'll be nice to us. And mythology becomes unbelievably important to agricultural societies, because you've now gone beyond the kinship model. You've now gone beyond the tribal structure, and you need people to cooperate across a bigger span, right? So getting everybody sort of believing in the same story is very, very important, right? And it's not all bad, right? Because, like I said, people start to live longer. Art starts to happen. Plato, Socrates, all of these guys come from agricultural societies, right? With a big amount of division of labor. Okay, so, but this, what I'm trying to really hammer home here is that this outer stuff here, the change in technology, the amount, the seeds, the domesticated animals, the metals that are mined, these things that exist down here in the sort of available technologies and the systems, they have really profound effects on the internal experience of the individual and therefore on the culture, right? So that's kind of what we want to hammer home at this point, right? Okay, so what else can we say about the agriculturalists? Things kind of go along for quite a while as agriculturalists, and really what you're doing in to be cynical about it, agriculture is really the process in which huge amounts of natural ecosystems get turned into people, right? Because one thing that happens, which is kind of like, sounds unfortunate, but it's like there's hunter-gatherers over here, and there's agriculturalists over here, and these agriculturalists figure out that, whoa, if we chop down all this forest and we plant corn, we can go from being 100 people to 1,000 people, and we can store up the corn, and we can get people working, building roads, and we can train them to fight. And now suddenly there's 100 people over here and 10,000 people over here, and so it's only a matter of time before these people start running out of food, because that's the agriculturalists get into this kind of vicious cycle of, we always produce more food, but when you produce more food you get more people, so then you need to produce more food, and then you have more people to feed. And so eventually the agriculturalists go around, they beat everyone up and they make them join them, is more or less what happens, right? And so that's why the sort of, and then the mythology spreads, right? And the religion spreads with it, and it becomes very important to, and this is where empires only exist in agricultural societies, because there's no way you can send an army like halfway down the continent if you don't have a storable food source for them, right? And so anyway, it goes on like this, and then a really interesting thing happens. And remember, like I'm deliberately presenting this in, I don't want to say one thing changes and then it changes everything else. But this big and profound change occurs, I think over here. And the change is individuals and then cultures start asking one question. Anyone know what it is? Kind of, yeah. Is that true? Yeah. They start asking, is that true? And think about this, right? Because you could go back anywhere over the last 10,000 years since agriculture kind of became the dominant sort of system for producing food. And if you took like a serf from 5,000 years ago and you moved him anywhere along in time, say like 1,000 years before or 1,000 years into the future, he wouldn't actually see enormous changes compared to what you would see now if you went back 100 years in time and then 100 years before that. Like, you actually get more change technologically in the last 100 years than you did in the previous 200,000, right? And that's not terribly easy to explain why you've such a sudden change, right? But you do. And I think one of the key things in it was that, like I say, all the time, as people get freed up from needing to be the ones to get the food, there's more time for sitting around, there's more time for thinking, there's more time for abstraction, and if you think for long enough, you eventually start to think about thinking. Right? Does that make sense? And once an individual can think about thinking, they enter into what's called a rational phase of development, right? So these group phases, these group stages that I'm talking about here, every individual passes through them. My son right now is at the magical level of development, right? He's just totally in the moment and enthralled with what's happening, and he's completely uninterested in why things happen. They happen and he's fine, and as long as he trusts that they're going to keep happening, he's fine. At some point he will dissociate and he will go into a group, and he will, like, the myths of his time and the need to belong will pull him into a kind of like an ethnocentric level of development, right? Adolescents go through this, and it'll be very important for him to be a member of a group and to believe enthusiastically in whatever it is everyone else in the group believes in. And then at some point, individuals and consequently cultures start to think about thinking, and they start to go, well, is that thing that everyone says to me actually true? Right? And this is really profound, because now suddenly the mythologies of the agricultural society start to get questioned. And as people ask, is this true, we start to get extraordinary progress down here in the amount of technology available to us, right? And we start to really advance scientifically. And we start to have great success with this, right? And so then up here, individuals start to live much longer. We make all these incredible discoveries in medicine. We invent antibiotics, modern medicine in general. We exploit technologies. We find oil. We invent the engine, the locomotive. All of these things are possible because for the first time as a group, everyone becomes obsessed with this question of, is it true? What does it do, right? And at this point now, I think it's very important that that we start to look at something, which is, okay, there's a huge faction of the sort of permaculture community who think that what we need to do is go back to being hunter-gatherers. And when I got into permaculture first, I was kind of like, I was persuaded by this argument that it was like, we used to live in a utopia where everyone was free and there was no possessions and nobody did anything. You know, nobody had to like worry or stress or accumulate possessions or do all those terrible things that we do now. And so all we really need to do is go back to there. And it's like, well, I like Radiohead, I like Man United, I like the blues, and I like a bunch of other fucking shit, and so does everybody else, and we're not going back, and it's not a good idea. Right? So, because, and this is a lot of the point of this, the idea is not to go back, the idea is to integrate, right? So, okay, so we know, so we can see something happens here, right? And it becomes a reinforcing thing. Technology takes us further away from nature, right? So we start to live in this world where we have all this technology. No food is mass produced. We get a compounding of this thing I mentioned earlier, where life expectancy and safety of the individual is increased, but health is kind of decreased, to the point we're at now where someone is much more likely to eat themselves to death than they are to starve, right? And something really interesting happens with the inner landscape here. Because as a culture we have so much success at asking, is this true? And we do some really good things about asking that. So we get rid of kings and kingdoms after we switch to becoming rationalists, because it's like, they go, well, is it really true that God decided that King Henry has a divine right to rule us all? It's like, well, no, obviously you scrutinize that belief and it gets thrown out, and a lot of other ones get thrown out. And so this is where down here you get nation states now develop. Nation states and democracy, because that seems like a much fairer way of doing it. Well, let's all elect someone. That's only possible for like rationalists to do this. You know, and in the modern rational realm, you get like, you know, women's liberation movement, you get the abolition of slavery, you get, like I said, the great vast extension of life expectancy, all these great things. You get all this success from it, but, and this is Ken Wilber's critique on it, eventually what happens is we get so good at doing it that we overdo it. And this is kind of a thing that happens anyway. Your greatest strength will always become your greatest weakness. And what we basically do is we throw out all the mythologies and we lose the fact that within the lie there's a greater truth. That's what the word mythos means. Mythos comes from the Greek word, which means the lie. It means something like this: the lie that tells the truth. So we forget that, right? And we forget really at all that there's an inner world worth paying attention to at all, at the worst level of it, right? So we kind of get to this point where the psychiatrist is the one who rules, and he says, well, that person is depressed because they have low serotonin levels and their salt level is off, and it's purely a kind of it's purely like a medical problem that we can address with you know, with just changing the dosage of serotonin or whatever it is, right? And people now are obviously starting to figure out that that's an absurd thing. This quadrant system is actually really useful for that kind of thing, because you can start to look at problems across the quadrants, right? So you can say, well, like, okay, this person who's depressed, let's say, low serotonin levels, low whatever else, high levels of cortisol, whatever sort of stuff you can do over here, and there's a lot of it, right? You can say, well, not great diet, works as an accountant, but you can start to look over here and you can go, well, how much meaning has this person got in their life? How excited are they? what's their experience like, what's their childhood experience, what kind of group do they exist in, and what's the culture and the atmosphere within that group. And all of those things, like I say, they require interpretation. But so people who are holistic and holistic healers should be looking across the 4 quadrants when they, that's kind of, I think, partially what it means to be holistic. Okay, so anyway, here we are now. And I'm trying to tie this up and land on like why permaculture, like what does this have to do with permaculture? So where does permaculture fit into this? In what quadrant?
The bottom right.
Bottom right, exactly. It's a land management, it's a system. It's a system that allows us to like manage land, produce food, design businesses. It's all lower right stuff, right? But what would it do then across this? Let's just say it became the dominant way that in which those things are done. Let's just say, you know, governments wake up and start subsidizing it the same way as they subsidize Monsanto now, and universities started to like really take it seriously and make sure that every engineer, agronomist, architect was well versed in ecology, you know, and the billions that's out there getting fucking wasted started to go into this. Well, what would it do to the individual, right, on an objective sphere? Well, it would mean, for one thing, we'd have much better diets. Right? Like if you eat local, organic food grown in compost, grown in soil that has like, you know, lots of microorganisms in it. So we'd have better diets. Access to things like clean water and air would increase. Air would increase. Then if you go into the subjective experience, well, for one thing, that would make the brain and the body work better. So that alone would just increase the chances that individuals start to make like better decisions. But in the inner realm, then for the subjective realm for the individual, we've mentioned, right, there's these 3 main stages of development, right, like magical, mythological, rational. We want to know as a culture and as individuals go beyond the rational, right, and reconnect with the inner realm. One of the ways you connect with this is through meditating. That's what meditating is, right? It's actually like closing your eyes and sort of going like, wow, there's all this stuff going on. And there's this entire inner invisible world. But you can't force things to grow. What you can do is you can create conditions in which growth is lightly. And one thing we definitely know is that the more connection people have with nature and healthy ecosystems, the more a feeling of connection is likely to produce itself, right? So we're almost certain that with more forests, more clean water, more trees, better diets, the likelihood of experiencing a sense of connection is higher, right? And then that paves the way for kind of like a new culture to emerge. Because what we want really down here is we want the emergence of a new culture. And what do we want that culture to look like? Well, we'd like it to value nature. We would, but more importantly, we would like it, in my opinion, to integrate and respect everything that's gone before it, right? And what I mean by that is we're not trying to go back to being hunter-gatherers, but we are trying to integrate that deep connection to nature and sense of connection that our early ancestors would have had. We're not trying to go back to being mythologically orientated agriculturalists, but we would like to recognize the deeper truths in those mythologies. That's why studying mythology and actually looking at the deeper truths in the old religions is a very, very useful thing to do. And we would like to take those learnings, and then we would also like to integrate all of the extraordinary discoveries that we made by going, is that true? Right? And we would like to integrate all that, and we would like to create something new with it. And that, I mentioned the direction evolution goes in earlier. That is exactly how evolution works. Evolution integrates and transcends, right? It's Ken Wilber again here. So what does that mean? A molecule integrates all the atomness of atoms and it creates something new. A cell integrates all the moleculeness of molecules and it creates something new. And the new thing that's created is always unimaginable from the previous level, right? So we absolutely don't want to get into the overly designing a culture or a utopian system. They tried that in the totalitarian states in the last century, and it was a complete fucking disaster. What we want to focus on is is basic ecological fundamentals, and a kind of a trusting that you'll get advancement through this, and a trusting and a hope and a faith that you'll get a new, more integrated culture emerging from that. Does that make sense? Yeah. And I'm going to stay on then the topic of integration. It's become such a kind of an area of fascination for me, because hopefully we understand it in terms of this, but on a personal level, integrating or integration work, and this term comes from Carl Jung, the idea of integrating your shadow on an individual and a species level is absolutely fundamental, right? And what it means really is it means getting comfortable with the idea that every awful thing ever done was done by a human, and you're a human. So you're capable of that as well. And if you deny that or you repress it, it's the same kind of disaster you get when you deny or repress the sort of subjective interior realm, which is what we've been doing for the last 500 years. So, and and a lot of people are really uncomfortable with that. And there's a lot of this kind of stuff out there at the moment where we kind of go like, look at all the damage being done by humans. Like I just saw recently that new David Attenborough documentary, the one about all the loss of biodiversity and what's it called? Human Planet? Something like that. And David Attenborough is a lovely man, but he's lamenting all of the, all of these species that no longer exist anymore, and it is horrifying. But the whole way through the film, it's just like footage of these beautiful apes or these beautiful cheetahs or this beautiful something that don't exist anymore, and then the thing rolls forward and it's like, number of people in the world, now it's this many, number of animals, this many, and then you get to the end of the documentary and you're like, okay, so what, we have to kill people? Is that what this is saying? Like, and it's really easy to reach that conclusion, right? It's really easy to sort of look at it and go, wow, nature is perfect and humans are fucking awful, and if we care about nature, we should like, and you see this all the time, like conservationists want to put fences everywhere, and they want to go like, nature's there, humans are over here, don't let the two mix. And you get all of these messages like, lower your footprint, just like tiptoe around the planet, try not to fuck anything up, and all of these ideas are very much they're disintegrated ideas. They're missing the fucking main point, which is that if destruction on that level is possible, the opposite of that must be true, right? And this is the key thing, because, and again, remember I talked about, like, we want to integrate the greater truths of the mythological era. And there's a lot of them, by the way. But one key one, the story of, like, the Garden of Eden, right? What's that story about? The Garden of Eden, there's Adam and Eve. They eat the forbidden fruit, and they're thrown out of the Garden of Eden. Well, there's a bunch of things going on, right? One, it's leaving the sort of the beautiful connected stage that I would imagine some hunter-gatherers experience, right? And so it's going. There's that's in there for sure. But there's another thing in it, which is like the idea that evil comes into the world when Adam and Eve look at each other and they see that they're naked, because nakedness implies vulnerability. And God knows that they've strayed from the Garden of Eden when they want to, like, cover themselves up, right? Because that instinct to cover yourself up is very primordial. We want to do it because we don't want our vulnerable bits kind of like literally hanging out there. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is that once I know how vulnerable I am and I'm self-aware, I also know how vulnerable you are, right? So the capacity for evil only exists when humans with their neocortexes come along, right? And that's kind of like jarring to realize that. But the capacity for good and beauty and creativity also only comes along in that moment. And so we have a choice, right? And that's a very fundamental idea in the kind of Judeo-Christian faith or ideology, that the system is not the problem, being human is the problem. And it is a problem, and it's a complex problem, and it's one we should take seriously, because if we don't take it seriously and we just pretend it's not happening, right, we're really liable to fuck things up. And that's kind of what we've been doing. And so what I'm really, really big on is, like, you must take that capacity for malevolence and kind of violence and destruction and make friends with it, right? And kind of really decide every day not to do it. But not only that, in making friends with it, you kind of liberate yourself, and we liberate ourselves in general, to dedicate ourselves to, like I say, the opposite of destruction, which is creation. And what we're going to learn now in permaculture is a really complete and full toolkit that empowers us to do just that, right? Because it's all well and nice saying it, but so in this course, all of you should come out of this course able to look at any organic material in the world and know exactly how to turn it into, like, fertile soil to grow things in. Any of you, you'll all be able to look at any plant and instantly know how to make more of that plant and thereby increase the amount of photosynthesis. You'll all know a multitude of ways to harvest water and sink it into your land and capture energy in general on the site you're in. All of you should be very comfortable by the end of the course in looking at a piece of land and surveying it and planning out how to turn it from a degraded state into a thriving ecosystem, and how to greatly enhance actually its ecological health. And all of you should come away with the idea, ingrained in you, I hope, that a landscape that is interacted with intelligently by human beings is infinitely more diverse, more productive, and more healthy than one that's left on its own, right? And so that's the goal, and I'm really looking forward to going on this journey with you all. We did it. We did it.
Taking questions.
Yes, now I am.
You mentioned this, and I'm curious. What's the difference between gardening and ecosystem management?
None. Because the only difference is, are you conscious that you're managing an ecosystem or not? So permaculture is ecosystem design, and Dave Jackie, who's a really prominent permaculturalist who wrote Forest Gardens, he said that when he first started to say he wanted to design ecosystems, that a lot of his lectures in college were like, you can't design an ecosystem, ecosystems exist in nature and we can't do that. And then eventually he said he had this aha moment where he was like, wait, an ecosystem is just a series of relationships between living and non-living things that produces results and patterns. Everything is an ecosystem. We design them all the time. We're just fucking horrible at it mostly because we don't fucking understand basic ecology. Right, so the only difference between gardening and ecosystem management is whether the gardener is aware and conscious of the fact that he's actually managing an ecosystem, or she. What did I say? Okay. Yeah, that's the only difference.
The consciousness.
Yeah, the consciousness and then the awareness of what it is that makes up a healthy ecosystem. Yeah, so if the gardener, if she's aware of what it is that makes up a healthy ecosystem and she has the goal of turning her garden into a healthy, productive ecosystem, then none. If she's not aware of that, then she's likely to make kind of like more mistakes, basically, I would say. So when I first got into permaculture, I was like, fuck the system, I'm gonna go live in a community, grow all my own food, I don't want to, like, capitalism is bad, money is bad, organic food is good, like that's the level at which I was thinking then, right? I used to hang out in Guatemala City, like with a lot of, you know some of the people I used to hang around with, and you know, a lot of those guys, they're like really radical, work for NGOs, work in human rights, and you know, it was all this kind of discourse about like, oh, we need to like dismantle the capitalist system and go back to living in harmony with nature and growing all our own food, and you know, not using money, and it's just stuff people say, like no one actually does it. And I remember I was hanging out with a bunch of these kind of radical dudes in Guatemala when I first came here, and I was very taken by all their ideas, and I was like, wow, this is so mind-blowing. And then like off I went and like got really into permaculture, lived in a bunch of eco communities, did all these things, and 5 or 6 years later, like I went back there and I'd stayed in contact with a lot of these guys who like hang out in bars and smoke pipes and philosophize, and they were like, oh, you know, what we got to do is take the capitalist system apart and stop using money, and while they're like drinking their beers, and I was like, I actually did that and it fucking sucks. Like, it doesn't suck. I'm really glad I did it and like learn to be independent and learn to build and learn to grow food, but nobody wants to be a fucking subsistence farmer. Like, nobody. It's really hard. There's a reason people stop doing it. And so this is what I mean about the romanticization of the past. And it's like, oh, if we could just go back to when my grandma was around, and it's like, yeah, well, there's a reason people like stop doing that, being a subsistence farmer. And you know, and it's like I did it here for a long while. When we started off first, I was like, we got the goats and we started milking them and growing veggies, and at the start I had to start this project, I had so many responsibilities on the farm, and I'm really glad I did at the start. But after a while you're like, I don't want to fucking milk the goats on Sunday morning, I want to play with my kid. You know, and so I'm trying to get back to your question, like what does that look like in terms of division of labor? I probably think that farm work is a bit like trades or carpentry. We absolutely want a big-ish percentage of the population doing those things, But we probably, in an ideal situation, want them doing it for a while when they're young and energetic, and then transitioning on to something else. I think being a farmer is a bit like being a teacher. It's like everyone should do it for a while.
That's good. That's very good. Because again, in the bigger sphere of things, like how does that system work?
Right.
In the most holistic way for everybody.
Yeah. I mean, like, so permaculture in its essence, right? It's more intensive and less extensive, right? So agriculture, the direction it's gone in over years is in terms of how like extensive can you make it, right? And so that's why in the States you have like spray the whole field with a plane, kill everything, go out with a tractor, plant the seeds, you know, like you only need 2 workers for every 5,000 hectares. It's great, right? Like it's absolutely horrible. And what we actually want is we want much more intensive, diverse systems and food producing systems, but they're much more labor intensive. They require much more human input, but that's fine. The problem is the solution. We'll talk about this. It's like, well, we have all of these people who are disconnected from nature, who don't have jobs, who don't have work, who need to learn things. So it's like, you know, if I was in charge of these types of things, I would be setting up work programs for young people to go into kind of training and to learn to farm and to learn to do all this stuff, you know, as a sort, the same way we probably need that kind of a system in Europe, realistically, the same way you have to do your, you know, if you're from Israel, you have to spend a year shooting at Muslims. It's like, if that was like you have to spend a year planting trees, it would probably actually be more effective in dealing with that situation. I mean, I don't know. But yeah, so you'll see it with this farm. Like, there's so many different things to manage, and it does require a lot of responsibility. And one of our goals with this farm was to create employment for the local community, and we're definitely doing that. But it is like permaculture systems require a lot of maintenance.
And very similar to your original idea when you first came out here, the idea of wanting to go back in time.
Right.
What would it look like when you bring the permaculture principles and the behaviours of permaculture in with technology? What would the world look like?
Well, that's like, you know, I don't know, right? So that's the kind of thing, right? If you say down here we're going to have like permaculture systems everywhere, right? That's our main food producing and overriding food producing land management system is a permaculture one. And we're marrying that with like, you know, the best of the technological world, right? So we're using mass renewable energies, and we still have the internet, you know, like, so renewables, what else would we have down here? Circular economies would be a big one. Do people know what a circular economy is? Let's actually do this, right? Like, a circular economy is one where the economy is set up the same way that a permaculture farm would be, which means there's no energy losses, right? So you grow the things and you add value to them in the place that they're grown, and you sell them in the place that they're grown. And then what that does, so if you look at that, like, the opposite to a circular economy is, say, what happens here with coffee. Everyone grows coffee, then the coffee gets picked fresh, it's like a little grape, and it all gets mixed together and mixed with the coffee from all over the lake and sent down to a big coffee processing facility down at the coast. And they process it, they depulp it, they wash it, there's all these byproducts from that, but it's so far from where the coffee's grown that all of those byproducts just end up like leaching into a river or a lake instead of getting used as fertility back here. And then the coffee gets turned into Nescafe or Starbucks and sent all over the world, right? And the cafe owner or the Starbucks owner gets rich and everyone else kind of gets screwed, basically. And there's all these losses in the system versus like, you know, what we do here is we have 2 or 3 farmers that don't put chemicals on their coffee. We buy our coffee from them. We process it here. The pulp gets turned into worm compost. The water from washing the coffee goes down into our pond and irrigates our garden. The shells get charred down and turned into biochar, so no waste. All of that goes back to the system, and then the money also stays here, so we can pay those farmers more because we're the ones making the money from selling the cup of coffee. And that's what a circular economy looks like, basically. And you could do that with like a million different things. And it's kind of perfect for permaculture because it's like one of my like visions here that more and more people are buying into is that we could have like a permaculture community where we all have these kind of like food forests and forest gardens, and different ones of us add value to those products in the locality, right? And like, you know, we do it here with the goats and the cheese and the coffee and the veggies, but there's a million other things that you could do here. You know, avocados grow like weeds. Somebody should make avocado oil and sell frozen avocados. There's a bunch, you know, there's like so many perennial tree crops that could be incorporated into a circular economy here. There's so many, you know, you look at like lake cleanup initiatives. It's like, it's more interesting if you think in terms of, as a permaculturalist, it's like, well, so you got this dirty water flowing into the lake. What would it look like if you filtered that dirty water through bamboo? And then what would it look like if, you know, there was a cooperative of local people doing something cool and creative with that bamboo? That would be like a circular economy type thing, right? And so if permaculture was our dominant land management strategy, most of our energy was coming from renewables, we had circular economies, well, what would the effect be on the individual and the objective? We think we would probably have much healthier individuals, partially because if people were going through their sort of military permaculture training as young people, they'd be getting more exercise, they'd be eating better food, they'd be breathing in cleaner air, right? So we'd get, by and large, just healthier individuals. The levels of connection, I think, for the inner kind of person, or the inner world of the individual would increase. The fact that the brain was working better because of better foods and you know, better fats and all this kind of stuff, would create more conditions for growth in the interior individual landscape. And what would the culture that looks like that come from? I think this is the big question, really. Like, where are we going as a culture? Like, because for years, and this is I don't have the answer to this question. For years, for forever, basically, we've been going more and more in the direction of like a global culture, right? And that's great in a way. Like, you know, for one thing, people are getting over these deeply held kind of tribal beliefs, and and so that's great. A really good example, by the way, in terms of understanding this stuff is like, look what happens in the global culture, or the move towards global culture, once you have a television. That's a thing that exists down here, but it causes the culture to stand up and say, no, you can't kill people in Vietnam, right? Like, that had never happened before. But because you get a technological change, that causes like a cultural shift. But we have been going in this direction forever, really, of increased collectivization. You go from tribes to kingdoms to nation states, and now we're sort of inching towards like a world government. And again, it's like, is that good? Is it not good? I don't know. My preference for how I would like to live is, I would like to live, and I would like to see more of, autonomous communities where it's all about like local governance that can exist kind of on the periphery of, you know, big nation states. I can't really see any way around that. I think we are going to get kind of like a sort of a global governance situation, and when you really look at what's happening in the world, it's hard to argue against that. You know, like, could we like move past having to have one nation have a war with the other over resources, and could we actually just accept the fact that we all have to share this planet, and therefore some level of governance is probably necessary? But then, like, as a permaculturalist and an individual who doesn't like to be told what to do, I rebel against that. So how do you reconcile those two things? It's like, well, I think the answer is for people to get together in medium-sized groups, sort of like sequester land, manage their own energy, food, resources as best they can, and exist on the edge of that. And that allows for like homogenization and diversity to kind of coexist. Because you absolutely have to, I didn't get to ethics yet actually, you absolutely have to have some set of agreed upon norms as a culture, right? And like, you know, and like again, there's no real getting around that. And so that's something that was kind of like the ending point of this lecture actually, is these guys, not only did they come up with definitions and principles for permaculture, they came up with 3 ethics, right? Which is people care, earth care, fair share, is how they're written in the book. And I think about this a lot. It was one of those sections that I often would teach it and be like, oh God, I hate talking about the ethics. I don't really know what to say. I think kind of where I've got to is they're just like the way permaculture ideally would just be a very foundational thing in the way we manage land. I think the ethics are just a very foundational set of ethics. Look after the earth, look after each other, and don't hoard stuff too much. Like, that's all it's really saying. And it's just like permaculture. Those would be like necessary ethics, but not sufficient ethics. So permaculture, in my view, it's a land management and design system that is necessary, but not sufficient for species evolution to occur. People understand that? Necessary, but not sufficient. So if we don't kind of do this across, you know, on a large scale over the next 50 or 100 years or whatever it is, we'll definitely die. Or like cease to exist, or something, you know, really, if we don't like cop on, basically. But by virtue of doing it, it doesn't guarantee that the stuff on the interior realm is going to happen. It just sets the necessary conditions. It's like a neocortex is necessary but not sufficient to become enlightened. Like a bear can't become enlightened in the way that we understand it, right? Because it doesn't have a neocortex. But having a neocortex doesn't mean you're definitely going to become enlightened. In fact, far from it, right? So, and permaculture is like that, and the ethics are the same. It's like, if we could have those kind of ethics of like, look after the planet, look after each other, and don't hoard too much, if that was a sort of a cultural norm, you need more. But that's kind of for each group of people and individual to decide for themselves. Like, what's your position on? That's actually like a really good question, because in some senses, kind of where one of the problems with the rational age, where we say like, is this true, and we like toss out all the old mythologies. Again, like, very useful and probably good that it happened, but it did create this enormous vacuum that Nietzsche was one of the first people to talk about, right? He said like, God is dead. and you won't be able to wash the blood from your hands. It will run in the street. He understood that this was going to cause enormous problems, because what he understood, and he sort of saw it coming, was that when you remove God from the equation, which we kind of did in the sort of scientific rational age, you completely remove the compass, or the sort of moral compass that people had for a very, very long time before that. And you can't just get rid of it. Something will come in to take its place. And that is kind of what happened. And so, like, the first thing that came in to take its place was actually the sort of nation-state model, and the sort of like the totalitarian state that said, like, we're going to eliminate all the evils of capitalism. We're going to equalize outcome through good governance. But that was the state trying to become God. And now, like, so many of the kind of like bitter arguments that people are having, it's taking place in the absence of a kind of an agreed upon set of kind of like morals, really. And it is actually a huge problem. And you can see the main debate politically is between the rationalists and the mythologists, people at those two levels of development. So your typical kind of liberals are at a rational level of development, and your typical conservatives are at a mythological one. And the typical conservative is terrified at what happens when you remove God, right? And the typical rationalist is appalled that, like, the conservative wants to make people stick to these kind of like archaic rules, and they're at each other's throats, really. And what you want is someone to sit both of them down and say, it's okay, you're both right, but there's shit that neither of you can kind of see, you know. And that's more or less what we want to be like going towards. All right, any other questions?
So for the bottom left corner, would you say that then our society would be just more of an evolved agrarian society?
For the bottom left?
Yeah, or is it that if that goes into that?
No, so where, like, this one is so this is a question mark, really. It's like, well, what type of culture? If this was your bottom right behavior, and you had healthier kind of individuals, and, you know, higher levels of kind of connection, the culture that emerges out of that, like,
That's for us.
that's an emergent property. We don't know what that actually looks like. Like, we can guess. It looks a bit like here on a Friday night.
Let's go and play.
You're trying to integrate all of it. So you're trying to, like I say, you're trying to integrate the sort of like all of the things that the magical hunter-gatherer would have felt and understood, with the deeper truths of the mythological era, you know, with the capacity to be rational and question things of the rational area. And really where we're looking to go to culturally and individually, by the way, is to a kind of like a non-dual level of awareness. So these interior levels of awareness, they go magic, mythic. This is to use Ken Wilber's terminology, but I think this is quite good stuff, just because it's been about 1 million different people have come up with a sort of a similar developmental sort of developmental levels, right? So magic, mythic, rational, existential, non-dual. So existential is when you're halfway through, like, explaining to everyone how to fix the world, and you're at this kind of rational phase, and you're saying, well, if we can just replace this system and do this and blah blah blah. Existential is when you eventually wake up and go, oh fuck, this doesn't matter at all. And a lot of people kill themselves when they get to that phase. And it's very important, by the way, at this phase that you really wrestle with the idea of suicide. And you really, because, you know, on some level, every existentialist kind of goes like, what the fuck is the point of this? We should all just kill ourselves. And that's a really good question to wrestle with if you find yourself at that phase. And most people, actually, it's in the hero's journey. There's a reason for the dark night of the soul and the death and the rebirth, and it happens here, basically. It's the moment you get set free. Because once you really look at it and say, well, would that help? Would it help if I killed myself? And it wouldn't. It would make things worse for everyone you care about, right? And it would actually negatively affect things for generations to come. And so it doesn't do anything, but hopefully the mere fact that you ask yourself the question then leaves yourself with well, I kind of feel like killing myself, but I've thought about it and I'm a responsible individual and I know that it wouldn't help anything, so where am I left? Where does that leave me? And what we want, I think, sort of individually and culturally, is we want to see, I think, more people with this non-dual level of awareness where we stop with the labeling of things as good and bad, right? That's really important. Steiner was big on that. One of his things was like, stop labeling things good and bad, look at them as fruitful or sterile, right? And that was one of the points he was trying to get across there. And one where there becomes, one of my hopes in the new emergent culture is that we develop much more of a focus on responsibility over rights. Right? The rational worldview and the whole thing about being a nation state, the discourse is always on what are my rights. And again, this is just, it's integrating an old idea that a lot of indigenous cultures had about the world, which is that actually humans are co-creators in the world, and that once you become an adult, it's time to like pick up your load and take responsibility for like making the world better, right? And so if we have a culture like that emphasizes responsibility, we have individuals who have like more higher levels of meaning in their lives, meaningful lives. And I don't know exactly what that looks like, but I think that seems to be like a really like key idea.
And you have a culture that's for, I suppose, acceptance to be a bigger thing too. It's less about labels, it's more about that's what you're doing, this is what I'm doing.
Right.
And we can both live together.
Yeah.
Instead of being
Yeah. So yeah, those are good questions, right? Like I'd like to see a culture that emphasizes responsibility more, and more accepting culture would be great.
because it's less about the label then.
Yeah. And it's also less about the kind of like, the labeling things of good and bad.
More fluid rather than rigid.
Yeah. And that's exactly how, so these levels of awareness, right, they exist for individuals. So every individual is at a particular level, but where the culture really is just the aggregate of all of the individuals within it, right? So if enough individuals kind of get to this non-dual level of awareness where they're sort of accepting responsibility for their own lives and for their part in making the world, because that's a key part, right, of becoming like, of having non-dual awareness, is you start to realize that you're not just in the world, you're made of the world and you're making the world, right? Because not really what non-dual awareness gives people is it gives them the capacity to be okay with contradictions. because all of the great questions are contradictions, but the answer is a contradiction. It's like, well, am I creating the world or am I created by it? Well, it's both, right? What are some other like big questions?
Is the universe expanding or our consciousness?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Like that, and it is the universe expanding, or does it only expand when we become like more aware of it? And it's like, yeah, it's both, right? Is Monsanto good or bad? Well, without Monsanto and everything that goes with it, then you don't have permaculture. So if you like permaculture, then you kind of have to like fucking all the other shit, like, because there is no, if everyone was doing permaculture, then it wouldn't be a thing, right? So, like, and getting out of that, like, oh, capitalism is terrible, but it's like, but I like Radiohead. Well, there's no Radiohead without capitalism, and that kind of thing, and being able to live without those kind of judgments. It's a process to get there, but the point is, if there's like a critical mass of human beings occupying this field of awareness, you get pulled up to it quicker. And that's culturally how center of gravities work. They'll pull people either up or down to wherever the sort of center of gravity of the culture is at, right? And so, again, what can you actually do about that? Take responsibility for your own level of awareness, right? It was always my thing with, like, the uber judgmental social justice warriors, and it's like, and you talk to them and it's like, well, I hate all the like discrimination and judgment that's in the world, and it's like, well, the only thing you can do about that is to become less discriminating and judgmental yourself, and you don't seem to be doing a very good job of that right now, so it's like, again, a lot of it really does come back to sort of like personal responsibility, and because again, it's like, it's a big thing, like, can you take responsibility for the fact that the level of awareness that you inhabit is actually permeating across the culture that you live in?